Hey everyone, welcome back. So obviously, chapter 12, we're looking, like I said, at police work and a little bit of the history of policing, and in particular how it works with the juvenile justice system and juvenile delinquents. So, just want to say history at a glance. If you took Intro to Criminal Justice, you know we talked a lot about the history of criminal justice, and we looked at how it developed over time. It started with community policing and practices where we held each other accountable, things of that nature, pledge system, watch systems, things like that. But as we went from a tribal type community and nomadic to industrial revolution and living in cities, the rise of police officers and things of that nature started coming. And so the important piece for juvenile justice in particular, and some of you will recall this because it's such a weird thing, but before the late 1800s, a youth offender, a juvenile delinquent, was not considered a child. They were considered to be a mini adult. They knew what they were doing, they did the wrong thing, and so they were tried as an adult. They were placed in adult prison. They were treated the exact same way. And to be fair, there were people at the time that were like, this is not okay. And so during the late 1800s, early 1900s, this was the time where people started going, okay, we need to change this. Now, there are some problems with some of the people that put forward these changes because they did it more as a tax write off or free labor rather than, you know, for the betterment. But this was the point where we went, yeah, we shouldn't be putting, an adult sexual assault offender with a youth theft offender. That's going to lead to bad problems. So, yeah, they changed it to being seen as children and they need to be treated as such. And so that is the brief overview history at a glance, the 50,000 feet view of juvenile justice history. So, getting into the actual meat and potatoes of this whole thing. And so, obviously, again, I've done all the writing part before. That way, we can just kind of talk about it. And so, in particular, the role of the police officer in general, if you recall, if you were in Intro to Criminal Justice, you know that the general idea is that it's to protect the general public, it's to work in the best interests of society as a whole, so protect and serve society. But the juvenile officer is in conflict because they also act in the best interest of the youth. They are supposed to view the juvenile as an individual, and so this role conflict where you want to, rehabilitate and protect the individual, but you also need to work in the best interest of the child. And so it leads to a lot of conflict, personal, not like physical conflict, but an internal conflict of ethics and morals. And so it's not easy. It is definitely one of the uh, hidden problems of the juvenile justice officer. So just important to note that, the role of the officer is in constant conflict because sometimes acting in the best interest of a child means ignoring the standard rules for operating in society. And so, with that in mind, though, we have to remember that there are violent juvenile crimes. We've talked about a couple before. There's been mentions in discussion boards about them, so it is an important note. But violent juvenile crimes are not that they're few and far between because they are definitely issues. But the idea behind violent juvenile crime, this is the what do I want to say? The breakdown of what constitutes a violent juvenile crime are things like homicide, rape, robbery, aggravated assault, kidnapping, things of that nature. And so, obviously, officers are part of this, but another big quality or a big piece of this and why I have this here is community policing. So we are gonna come back around to this idea, um, but community policing is also connected to a term that we have down here, which is problem-oriented policing. And we will, again, like I said, talk more about it. But I at least wanted to mention here that community policing is involving community members. These are things like neighborhood watches. These are things like having a particular community group from the community, even not neighborhood watch, but keeping an eye out for suspicious activity, things of that nature, and working hand in hand with police officers. And that's going back to Intro to Criminal Justice, going back to these concepts, because education is about building upon what you know. The data shows, we have the data that shows that when law enforcement works with community members, with individuals within these areas, that there is a genuine impact on crime and a positive impact in most cases. So community policing is important. It's important to engage and work together to solve a lot of these problems. And so it's just important to note that when it comes to violent juvenile crime in particular, one of the goals is to have a more community based work so that they notice these things and can, hopefully intervene beforehand, thinking back to intervention programs and earliest early interventions, things of that nature. So we will, like I said, we'll talk about problem-oriented policing, and we'll come back to how that's related here. But let's talk about the rule of law. And so previously, we had talked about in the last chapter, part of this notes even, is that, when we talk about the juvenile justice system and everything, there's a lot of similarities and a lot of differences between the juvenile justice system and the adult juvenile system, the adult criminal system. And so obviously there are similarities, but there are differences. And so just a couple big pieces to kind of remember. And this goes back into that list and some of the stuff we looked at, or rather briefly talked about, but this is one we didn't talk about. Arresting, as far as juvenile justice is concerned, there is more control in regards to arrest, simply because there's I wouldn't say a lower requirement for probable cause, but because the nature of juvenile delinquency and the fact that being under the legal age in that area means that things like staying out after a certain point in time, aka curfew violation, is something that you can be caught with. That is something that reduces probable cause. This is something we didn't really talk about in the school section, but important to know. Probable cause in the school means that, yes, school officials are allowed to search your locker. It's not a violation of your right to privacy. It's a weird sub thing, and if you really are interested, we can talk about it one-on-one, but in general, probable cause is a lot lower with a youth in regards to that kind of stuff. And same with, in particular, search and seizure. So I know we've kind of talked about search and seizure before in Intro to Criminal Justice. I don't know if I use the exact words or not, but so typically the same rules apply for search and seizures. This has to do also with probable cause. And in general, a lot of the same rules for the criminal justice system apply to juveniles. Obviously, there are some minor exceptions, but concept 12.1 on page 336 is actually a short list of warrantless searches, and it's related to this and why I wanted to talk about it and emphasize this. So truly, the warrantless searches are things like stop and frisk, search incident to arrest, automobile searches, consent search, plain view, electronic surveillance, and home entry. We did briefly talk about some of these in intro, but so a stop and frisk is the most well known, I would say. One to the general public, these are the someone seems suspicious, and so they're acting suspicious, so you're allowed to stop them and say, "Hey, can I talk to you?" And if they seem even more suspicious, then you have the right to search them. And this is important and why the warrantless search concept summary on page 336, 12.1, it explains what the scope of the search is allowed. So a stop and frisk is a pat down of a suspect's outer garments. So obviously, a stop and frisk, you're not going to be doing a cavity search looking for drugs. No, you're patting down to see if they have anything on them, like in their pockets, things of that nature. Obviously, a search incident to arrest. This is where full body search after a legal arrest. So you act suspicious, you fought back, you were put under arrest for resisting, and then they search you and oh, they found it. That kind of thing. Automobile search. This is one of those weird gray area ones. So if probable cause exists, a full search of the car, including the driver, passengers, and closed containers found in the trunk, are allowed, but the search must be reasonable. And that's important. Just because an officer stops you doesn't necessarily mean that they can search the full car. But if you're acting suspicious, you are driving suspiciously, then yes, they have probable cause to search your vehicle. But the non-reasonable doubt can't be there. It has to be for a reasonable belief of some kind of suspicious activity. Obviously, consent search is a warrantless search of a person or place is justified if the suspect knowingly and voluntarily consents to the search. So if an officer asks you, "Can I search your vehicle?" and you say, "Yeah, go ahead," they got you. You said yes. They're allowed to do the whole thing. Plain view is just suspicious objects anyone can see in plain view. Like, I don't know how else to say plain view. Um, if you open your door and the officer can see a blade, that's a weapon. It's plain view. It's not hidden. That kind of thing. Electronic surveillance, obviously, material can be seized electronically without a warrant if the suspect has no expectation of privacy from that kind of surveillance or that kind of electronic monitoring. And then home entry. A home can be entered without a warrant if there's a reason to believe that evidence of a crime is being destroyed. This one we did talk about. Yeah. So in general, there are warrantless searches, but when it comes to juvenile justice, in particular, goes a little bit further. They still have their Fourth Amendment right. So, well, they have the Fourth Amendment right. They have, long story short, as you can see below, custodial interrogation. They have the same Fifth Amendment rights. We'll talk about that, but in general, just because the juvenile delinquent is a juvenile does not mean they do not get the same rights. In the past, yes, there were some issues, but as we've gone further and further, we've made it more fair, more equal, that just because you're under the age of 18 in most places does not mean you do not get the same rules applied. So you don't lose any of your rights from being a juvenile. Um, so it's important to note that the same rules apply. Obviously, with a search and seizure in particular, searching a locker is the same way as kind of a home entry, or rather a almost like a search incident to arrest kind of thing. But that's getting into very particular pieces of um, school and officer searching and that kind of stuff. But so custodial interrogation, the entire thing is that questions posed by the police to a suspect held in custody in the prejudicial stage of the juvenile justice process. Juveniles have the same right as adults against self incrimination when being questioned. Just because they are young and immature does not mean that they don't have the same Fifth Amendment rights, does not mean that they don't have the Miranda rights read to them does not mean that they aren't allowed to know. No, you have to inform the individual that you have certain rights. And so, truly, our text brings this up, and this is important. The waiver of Miranda rights, where you say, you waive that right, and so now, yeah, anything you say can and will be used against you. The waiver of Miranda rights by a juvenile is one of the most controversial legal issues addressed in the state courts. Like, the question becomes, does a juvenile delinquent truly understand the weight of those rights and what they say and how it has an impact? Like, there are so many cases about this, and there are debates and discussions from psychologists and doctors and things of that nature that go, is this okay? So it's important to note that thinking about custodial interrogation, again, same rights. They're supposed to be informed of their rights. And we've talked about that before. So obviously this video is going to be a lot shorter than the others because, well, we're going over a lot of things that we've talked about throughout this text. But now we needed to get into something that we've talked about in Intro to Criminal Justice, but we haven't really talked about here, and that's discretionary justice. So if you did not take Intro to Criminal Justice and you're here just in juvenile justice, let me be the one to tell you discretionary justice is the concept that the police officer, the person conducting whatever it may be, is allowed to use their own discretion when engaging in the public and with individuals. So, discretionary justice is one of the reasons why we have such a large debate in our country right now on effectiveness of police as well as social issues of police officers. When we allow individuals to use their discretion, this means that just because there's a rule in place doesn't mean it's going to be followed. Just because a precedent has been set doesn't mean it's going to be followed. They have the right to use their own discretion, and that leads to the issue. And so, our textbook identifies that there are several different things, and we're going to talk about some of them. So, when an officer uses their discretion, typically it's broken down into one of several different pieces that you can potentially use. And so, for sure, environment plays a big part of this. So, both, and when we talk environment, I'm not just meaning like physically where it's located, but I mean like the overall political environment of the town, city, village, whatever it may be. Environment makes a difference. If the environment is a little more conservative and a little more hard on crime, the discretion of the individual officer is probably going to be a little more harsh and punishing. Whereas a more liberal, relaxed view and seeing more of rehabilitation than punishment, probably going to see more discretion being towards releasing with a warning. Like, that is environment. It's also, unfortunately, neighborhoods. A high crime neighborhood is probably going to be a little bit more strict than in a affluent suburban neighborhood. Not saying it's right, but this is what we're talking about. Policy is the bureaucracy. Policy is red tape. Sometimes there are policies in place that make no sense, that kind of push the boundary, that push the line. So sometimes it's, there's a policy within a particular department where if you have this certain situation, you might act in a certain way where you follow the precedents. Or because, as we've discussed, there's a difference between federal law, state law, city ordinance. Um, Depending on where you are, your particular policies might be different. And so using your discretion sometimes is unfortunately stuck to a policy. But perhaps the most impactful and important one is situational factors for using discretion. And page 340, if you notice, I put it there. Page 340 lists some important pieces, and we need to talk about it. And so I am preference prefacing this by saying we are going to be talking about uh, police bias, and we are going to be talking a little bit about um, the seemingly inherent racism in a lot of cases. This is not to get political, this is not to dive into it, but this is evidence based, research based conversation that we need to talk about with this. And so, when officers use discretion, um, there has been a lot of data on this that goes back many years, and that's something I want to emphasize again. This is not just my opinion, this isn't just our author's opinion. This is stuff that you can find, and there is a lot of data on this. Most studies conclude that the following variables are important in the police discretionary process. And so a lot of these make perfect sense. The attitude of the complainant, the type and seriousness of the offense, the attitude of the offender's prior contacts with the police, the perceived willingness of the parents to assist in solving the problem in cases of a child, the setting or location where the incident occurs, whether the offender denies the actions or insists on a court hearing in the case of a child, the likelihood that a child can be served by an agency in the community, and the most problematic one, and the one why we have to have this conversation, the race, sex, and age of the offender. And so, this is where we get into the problem. Personal bias plays a factor in police discretion. And this is, again, not just me saying it, this is not the textbook saying it, there is the data to show that when engaging in discretion, there is bias for age, race, and gender. We talked a little bit about gender when we talked about oh my gosh, why am I drawing a blank? We talked about it in intro, but I also believe we talked about it here. But there's a concept of chivalry that some officers used to view women as in need of a knight in shining armor, so they didn't punish female offenders, rather offered support or let them go. Obviously, that's changed a lot, but so there is that gender bias, age bias. Young kid is being dumb. Sometimes we're a little lighter on a child or lighter on an older person. But the one that most people are familiar with, and why I saved it for last, is the racial bias. And knowing the demographic of this class, knowing the students who are in this class, I know some of you have some very strong feelings on this, and rightfully so. But it's important to note that there is data to show that there is a racial bias in a lot of police discretion. And this is why, if you are here and your goal is to get this degree and go become a police officer, I encourage you to consider your own bias when using discretion as an officer. It's going to make a difference. Um, so I will just briefly say before we get any further, um, our text does talk about the Michael Brown, Ferguson, Missouri uh, shooting and killing. Obviously, the textbook is not that old, but it's old enough that this was the biggest case, because this was pre 2020. So um, we've had a lot more since then. There's a lot more to talk about. Um, all that needs to be said, regardless of anything else, is um, if we follow the actual guidelines that are set out in this, if we look at a juvenile officer is meant to protect and serve the society but act in the best interest of youth by using discretionary justice and having a bias towards treating a black individual, a black youth, more harshly than a white youth, is that really doing them justice? Bias should not be how you determine how to treat someone. And that's just humanism. That's not anything else. Don't judge people based off of their race, the color of their skin, their beliefs, religious or otherwise. Like, it's not okay. Anyway, um, not that it's hard to transition from that. Obviously, I could spend an entire class talking about these kinds of issues, but I don't think that's the best for actually teaching. Um, if you want to have a discussion about these kinds of issues, please reach out to me and let me know. We can have those discussions. We can have them as separate pieces, um, that kind of thing. Anyway, to wrap up this conversation and wrap up this particular part of notes and everything. So the question is, what do we do? Or rather, what do they do? What do the police do when we consider the rule of law and discretionary justice and those kinds of things? So, what exactly are they doing? And so, this is where we talk about issues of aggressive policing methods and police school partnerships. So, real quick, aggressive policing methods, we have talked about this before. Again, remember that there is a difference between juvenile justice and traditional criminal justice. Obviously, juvenile justice officers do have to consider the youth uh, that is affected by this, but a lot of times these are things like, well, we put them in a boot camp, we scare them straight, we make them responsible adults. And the data shows that, just aggressive policing methods don't work. They do not have that positive impact that they're trying to get. So there's something to it that needs to be readjusted. Obviously, police school partnerships. We also talked about this before. I actually believe we talked about it in the last section where we talked about where is it? Yeah, school programs, DARE and GREAT. These are police school partnerships. The idea behind a police school partnership is that the law enforcement agencies work hand in hand with a school on a particular program that is meant to educate individuals and to lead them away from delinquency. And so that's why DARE, great in concept, terrible in execution. Great, great in theory, decent in execution. It's not the greatest, it's better than DARE. That's what police school partnerships are. Like I said, we've talked about them before, so I'm trying to not spend a lot of time about things we've already discussed. Community policing, as I've said before, this is, engaging members of the community and particular groups into, going back to those ancient roots of criminal justice where we held each other accountable, where we worked together and went, okay, don't be a jerk. Let's deal with this. So community policing really is, you know, police officers maybe not necessarily having a large presence in a neighborhood because data shows that an increased presence doesn't decrease crime, but maybe increasing engagement with community members can have a positive impact because, well, yeah, it's not officers, but now people in the neighborhood are holding each other accountable. That's the theory. And which brings us back down to problem oriented policing. If you remember, I said community policing, look at that. We came back there, and one of the big things that we talk about is problem oriented policing. And I'm going to write something here real quick that I wanted to save for last because we're going to talk about it in this. Okay, so problem oriented policing is also called problem solving policing, which makes sense. But this whole concept is the idea that you respond to underlying criminal incidents rather than the incidents themselves. So, in theory, the idea is you don't address the crime, you address what led to the crime. So, if you have an issue of increased theft in an area, you don't increase your arrest rate for theft. What you do is you look for, well, why are people going and committing theft more frequently? Does it have something to do with current neighborhood trends? Does it have something to do with a business going out? Like, what is it? And when you identify that, the piece that's led to the increase in crime, that's what you address, and that reduces your crime. That's problem oriented policing. That's being super proactive. That's saying, okay, here's the issue, what led to it. And so, because of this, and here's a fancy word for you, systemic or systematic, sometimes pronounced, but the systematic nature of problem oriented policing, because you have to identify these things. So, truly, problem oriented policing follows a very simple model. It's a 4-step model that is often referred to as SARA. SARA. I wrote it down in red. Hint, hint, it's going to be on a quiz or essay or whatever. But SARA is the way you remember the key terms of each step, and they are in order, SARA. And so the first step in problem oriented policing is scanning. This is identifying specific crime problems through various data sources. So this is victim surveys, this is crime reports, this is 911 calls. These are just incidents that are reported but never go through. Like, you take all of that data and you scan through it and you look for what is the problem. Once you've scanned through it, your second step is analysis. And that's where you have the data now. Now you're looking deeper. You're going to dive into it and you're going to be looking in particular for underlying causes. You're looking for those real, hidden but important pieces that have led to this. That's the analysis. So you scan through all of your data, you analyze your data, and come up with an actual, like, oh, this is the problem. Once you've completed the S and the A, now you go into response, the R. Response is taking the data and bringing together police and other partners. So again, community policing, who's the important piece? If it's a problem that involves school, the school would be a partner. But you're bringing together the data with the police and the partners to develop and implement a response to the problem based on the results. So you take your analysis, you meet with the people that can help, and you guys come up with a plan this is how we solve it. Ooh, excuse me. And then the last stage the last A is assessment. And this is where the response to the problem is evaluated. So in between the R and the R is figuring out what it is, and then you do it. You do whatever program, whatever intervention might be, and then you look at it. You're going to analyze it. You're going to assess it, because you can't use analyze twice. So you're assessing the response to the problem. You're looking at what exactly it's doing and how effective it is or is not. So an important thing in particular with this is that there are some kind of our book in particular refers to it as pulling levers policies and policing. Pulling lever policing is, for lack of a better word, going through the motions. Sometimes when we look at problem-oriented policing and we follow this SARA model, sometimes you're just doing things to check a box, and that's where things fall apart. It should be intentional with the idea of solving the problem. All right. That actually brings us up to the end. So real quick, just so you know, SARA can be found on page 345. But yeah, that will do it for this week for chapter 11 and 12. Notes, the quiz and discussion board is already available. If you have questions, please let me know. Otherwise, that's it. I'll see you for our last week, our last notes and everything. Bye for now.